But before that, the usual things. But my book, which is still available, and also the fact that I own and manage Dave Cushman's website. So a lot of things that you want to know about bees and beekeeping will actually be on Dave Cushman's website, but I expect you all know about that anyway. We keep getting asked every week, how's Nell and Rosie? Well, there they are. They're both fine. There's Nell, there's Rosie, and they're outside, hopefully with their heads on the mat. So challenge what you're told then. Well, as Carl said, unless of course I'm telling you, but that is in a jocular sort of manner, because even I, after 57 years of keeping bees, and that'll tell you how old roughly Carl is, I still get things wrong, and it may well be things that I've been doing for years and years and years. All of a sudden, something doesn't work. So why challenge then? Well, we've got quite a lot of new discoveries. There's quite a lot happening in the scientific world of beekeeping in the last few years. There's a lot of misinformation, perhaps poor, inappropriate advice. There's a lot of false logic, and a lot of this, of course, is caused because people tend to humanize bees. One of the problems, I think, with the modern beekeeper is that they don't always know what's going on inside the hive, so they assume the bees are humans, which of course they're not. And of course, that gives us inexperienced beekeepers. Some of the teachers are actually quite inexperienced as well, yet they're teaching probably out of needs, and also some of the writers. There are some very good, sound, experienced beekeepers, teachers and writers, but there are some who are a lot less experienced. And that, I think, is where a lot of the misinformation and myths and that comes from. There's also quite a lot of copying and paste, because, of course, if people haven't had the experience themselves, they write an article or something of that nature, or a website, and they go and find somebody else's words. And of course, they can't use the words as they are, so they rearrange them a little bit, and occasionally you get different meanings. Also, of course, the screen. There's a lot of forums these days, websites, YouTube, and those sort of things. And certainly with internet forums, you tend to get a pack mentality where a particular person or a particular method tends to get ridiculed, not from a position of knowledge, but from a position of lack of it. And also, strangely enough, in beekeeping, there's quite a lot of intolerance of other people's views, the way they do things. So in beekeeping, there are a lot of sayings, and two of the most well-worn ones are, bees don't read the books. Well, quite frankly, some of them aren't even worth reading. If I'm ever given a book, I tend to give it to the bees to read, and they tell me what the book's like. And the other one, of course, is you asked X number of beekeepers a question, and you get Y number of answers. Now, there could be for several reasons. Perhaps all the information isn't given. Somebody misunderstands what's said. Somebody doesn't even ask the question correctly. But the people who come out with these sayings, they tend to think that they're the only ones that have ever said it, the first ones that have said it. So as beekeepers, I think we need to ask, is what we're told correct? Well, correct is perhaps not the right word, because things could be correct in one situation, but perhaps not in another. So perhaps reliable is a more appropriate word. And that, of course, depends on a lot of things. Could be location, could be that something that is done in Kent, let's say, may not be appropriate to Cumbria or Ireland or wherever. Depends on the climate as well, and that could, of course, go with the location as well. Could be perhaps the time of year, because perhaps something that you would do in early spring, you may not do or may not want to do in in the back end of the summer. Also, the type of bee, and I won't say too much because this will be covered in the NatBit webinars that Carl mentioned. But the type of bee does make quite a lot of difference, because there are some bees perhaps you'd run on a single brood chamber quite easily, others you'd need a double brood chamber. If the questioner actually gives all the information, which I find is a little bit of a problem. So if I'm asked a question, I generally try to find out how the beekeeper has got in the situation in the first place. I remember several years ago now, I was phoned up by a local beekeeper, and they said that their bees were behaving strange and they weren't moving very fast, and they thought it was poisoning. So I went hurtling around there, and the bees weren't poisoned at all. They were starving. So, you know, you can get the wrong information. And of course, experience and knowledge, which I've already mentioned. Prejudice is something which is absolutely rife in beekeeping, and for lots of different reasons. Oh, don't take any notice of so-and-so, they talk rubbish. Well, they may or may not talk rubbish, but it could just be that the person tells you doesn't know anywhere near as much as the person that's supposed to be talking rubbish. They might just not understand it. And then, of course, misinterpretation. There's a lot of misinterpretation in beekeeping. Simple stuff like misreading a comb, or misinterpreting a term or something of that nature. Terminology is used to be fixed, but it's changing. Take a simple thing like uniting. Uniting has been uniting ever since bees were, or several colonies of bees were joined together. But now you hear people talking about joining and combining and amalgamating and all sorts of things like that. The real terminology is uniting. And if everybody used the same terms, we'd all know what everybody meant. So historical information, and even something that happened yesterday, is historical to a degree, especially if it's scientific. Very often it's superseded by later discoveries, and I'll give one or two examples as we go through. And of course, the further you go back, perhaps certainly to the early part of the 20th century, there was certain people who had reasons to promote what they were doing, and perhaps to discredit what was already there. So you've got to be just a little bit careful with historical information. However, not to worry, because help is on the way. There's a book to be published soon that will cover all these points. It's quite a big book, about 80,000 words. I can't tell you who the author is, but what I've tried to do is justify anything I've questioned, perhaps bring some discussion in, and perhaps offer an alternative, exactly the same as I have with this webinar this evening, which I've got a small selection of some of the points I'll make here. But before then, beekeepers, in my opinion, must know the basics, the simple sort of stuff that helps them keep their bees efficiently and with care and understanding. Because if you know the basics, you can very often work out if what you're told is reliable or it's dubious, or what the person is trying to achieve, or whatever. Please, please, please don't believe me just for the sake of it. I'm not expecting you to at all. I never do. Just try things out for yourself, and it's quite easy to do, because there's loads and loads of experiments that the ordinary beekeeper could do, some of which I've done, I will be highlighting this evening. What you need to do, of course, I'm not a scientist, but you need to make sure that your sample size is reasonable. It's no good doing something on one colony, and if it fails, it doesn't work. If it works, it's okay. You can't make your mind up like that. You need, very often you need some sort of control, and of course you need discipline, because if you work out what you're going to do, if you do something different, then it's going to skew the results. Now the results can often be very different, and what you do perhaps with a colony this week might not work next week. But don't worry, because it's a major problem that the scientists have. They very replication is often one of their major problems. Don't forget, folks, we are dealing with biology, and that in itself is a variable. Take a absolute simple thing. Probably everybody that's listening will know that after a worker egg is laid, the worker should emerge after 21 days. Well, that's sort of fairly normal, but if you take a queen away from a colony, have a look at it 23 days later, so 2 days over the top, and you'll probably find a worker brood emerging. So it's, you know, it is quite variable. What I do know is that if you've got two colonies absolutely side by side in the same apiary at the same time, in the same condition, if you do exactly the same treatment to both of them, you go back in a week, 10, 14 days time, and the bees have behaved differently. So you've got to be aware of these things. And of course, the more colonies you've got, the more you realise that, hang on, what I thought or what I was told or what so-and-so wrote isn't always going to be correct or suit you. Unfortunately, some of this stuff has got into mainstream thinking, and it worries me just a little bit that perhaps people are passing or failing exams because of what they're writing or saying. Right, that's the beginning. Now a few examples. How often do you hear that if you leave queen cells, you leave two? Why is that then? Well, it's pretty obvious really, because it's insurance. Because if one of them's dud, you've always got the other one. Yes, you have, but there's your problem. That's where they start. Because if both of them are okay, if the colony is in the right condition and everything else is right, then the chances are they will swarm on the first one to emerge. If not, what very often happens is it usually takes 4, 5, 6, perhaps even 7 days for the bees to detect the queen cell is dud. So what they do is they swarm on the first one to emerge, expecting the second one to emerge, and of course it's dud. Then of course what happens is you lose the swarm, somebody else has taken up beekeeping against their wishes with a chimney full of bees, and if they're within a couple of miles, they could be yours. So I suggest very, very strongly that if you're one of these people that leaves 2 queen cells, get yourself on the swarm list, and if anyone's got a swarm in their chimney within 2 miles of you, you make sure you go and take it out, because it could be yours. Now, here's a queen cell that's dimpled, and we're told that dimpled queen cells are the ones to use. So that one actually looked pretty good to me, and I suspect a vast majority of beekeepers would be happy with that. Well, I left it in a colony. I went back 7, 10 days later or whatever, and it was still there. So I cut it open, and there was a dead queen inside. So just because a queen cell has been left by the bees doesn't mean to say that even they can detect that it's dead. Now, all the books and all the teachers will tell us if we leave queen cells, make sure they're dimpled. Well, the one on the left is dimpled, the one on the right isn't. So I guess most beekeepers would raw the one on the right out. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, because how many people tell you that what actually happens is the bees work on the queen cells. So as soon as they're sealed, they're actually quite smooth. You can check this yourself, don't need me to tell you. And they put the dimpling on over the next 3 or 4 days. So probably the only difference between the one on the left and one on the right is that it's 2, 3, 4 days older. Now, I would agree that smooth queen cells may be dud, but if they're darkish, in my experience, then yes, I would agree. But one like that is probably only just 10 or 11 days away from the laying of the egg. I don't know how many times I've heard and read that bees will only swarm on swarm cells. They won't swarm on supersedure or emergency cells. Well, if you want to believe that, absolutely fine. But I reckon they will, because I've had it happen to me on many occasions. If the colony is in the right condition, the weather's right as well, everything's right. If they can see it as a swarming situation, they will. If you don't believe me, give it a go and see what happens. But I'm telling you that bees will swarm on all sorts of queen cells. We're told where queen cells are supposed to be on frames. The swarm on the bottom, usually. Some people will say it's on the sides as well of the frame. Supersedure, always on the face. Well, they often are, but it's, in my experience, pretty unreliable. They can be anywhere. And here's some swarm cells on the face of a comb. They've got to be swarm cells because there's 5 of them. So they're very definitely on the face of the comb. Here are some more. There are 4 there, look, on the face of the comb. And for good measure, there are the queen cell cups as well. These, however, are both supersedure cells. I know that because they were one of my colonies. You can tell that because look at those lovely dark bees that are in there. Supersedure cells are similar in age. So look at the tips of the cells have been thinned down. They will probably emerge within a few hours. But they're on the bottom of the comb, not on the face where we're supposed to find them. This one here, look, there's a sidebar. There's a queen cell on there. So if you believe people, that should be a swarm cell, but it very definitely wasn't, because it was the only one. It was a queen cell and it was a supersedure cell. And I have to say, I missed it in a colony, which is quite easy to do if there's only one of them, and they swarmed. Luckily, I clipped my queens, so I actually found the swarm underneath the hive. But you know, that proves both of the things that I'm trying to tell you. We're told that in a wild colony, the points of the cells are always at the top of the comb. Well, here's a colony that I took out of a building earlier this year, and if you have a look at that area there, I'll blow it up, and if you look closely, you'll find that those cells are all over the place. So I'm sure the people that tell you these sort of things probably never taken a wild colony out of a building or a tree. Propolis, dear oh dear oh dear. How often are we told not to breathe from heavy propolizers? And beekeepers as well. Oh, I don't like propolis because I play the piano, or it makes a mess of this or makes a mess of that, or something else. But I've removed several hundred wild colonies from their places where they chose to nest themselves. Could be buildings, could be trees. In every one, if they've been in there any length of time, that is, if they've only just gone on in there, not the case. But what they do is they coat the inside of the cavity with propolis. Also, excuse me, when I started keeping bees, we the vast majority of beekeepers didn't do any spring cleaning. A few did, but some of them, they just keep the bees in the same hive for 10, 15 years or so. And the insides of the boxes were absolutely plastered with propolis. Well, it's always been considered to be a nuisance until a few years ago, and it was discovered that because propolis is antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-everything else, what the bees are doing is actually putting a shield around them, and it's self-medication. So really, they're dealing with diseases and pathogens themselves. So that brings into question in my book the practice of flaming boxes out every so often. We're always told that we must flame them out to get rid of disease. Well, firstly, you've got to make sure disease is in there in the first place. So how can you just assume something? And secondly, we as beekeepers are removing what the bees are putting there themselves to deal with it. So all I do is I just scrape out with a hive tool at spring clean, and that's it. I've never ever flamed any boxes out. Here's a colony in a wooden building. Another one I took out earlier this year. You can see, if you can see my my cursor, I think this was 4x2, so it was only 4 inches deep. That is plywood at the back on the inside, and on the outside are boards about 4 or 5 inches wide, something like that. So these are the boards, and if you have a look there, the area on the bottom left is where the board was covered up. On the right was where it was exposed to the bees. Look at the propolis they put on there. This is the propolis shield that these bees are using for self-medication. Have a look back into the cavity and look at the plywood there. Look what the bees have done. They've just coated it lightly with propolis. Here's a module 6 question. I'm not sure, it was about 2014. And the question was, approximately how long after queen loss are queen cells likely to be started? That would tend to suggest that there's some sort of answer somewhere. Associated with that, a lot of beekeepers think that when you take a queen away from a colony, all the emergency cells are started together, and they come to the conclusion that those that are sealed first must have been the older ones when they were started, so they're the ones that you rip out. It's all assumption, of course. Over the years, I've observed that that's not actually the case. They are very variable. So you've guessed it, I did an experiment to try and cover both of these points. And the results I put in Patterson's page in BBK News. If you want to go back and look at the old ones that are on, or the old copies that are on BBK website, have a look, page 349, October 2019. And this is what I did. I took 4 colonies and I dequeened them all on 22nd of May last year, 2019. Here are the colonies that I called A, B, C, and D. To the right of that, what happened the following day, the day after. They're the bracket, they're the figures in brackets. So 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later. Also, the number of queen cells that were there at the time. So you can see from that that things vary quite a bit. Now, explain a little bit about the colonies. Colony A, that was actually a swarm that came into a bait hive on the 12th of April, so only, what, 5 or 6 weeks earlier. If you look along the line, there aren't very many emergency cells there. That may be the reason why there's a low number. I don't know. That might in itself might need a bit of investigation a bit later on. Now, the other three colonies I call B, C, and D. All of those were full colonies with 2 to 3 supers on, as you'd expect that time of year, all with overwintered queens. From memory, they were all 2018. Now, a day later, 3 of them hadn't even started queen cells, and what I did was I shook the bees off every frame, every one. Because of course that's the only way that you can count them. And as soon as they'd started changing worker cells into queen cells, that's when I logged them down. So 3 had done nothing, and after 24 hours, 1 had done 14. The following day, 2 days later, 3 of them had started queen cells. 1 still hadn't started queen cells, which actually fell into exactly the same situation that I'd seen on many occasions before, which of course is why it interested me that it was a question that was asked in an exam paper. If you go on to the 5th day with colony A, all of a sudden they put in another couple of queen cells. Why leave it that late? But of course bees do this sort of thing. And colony D, they had decided to increase as well. They've already got 11, but they decided they want another one. After 4 days, colony B, that's the one with the most queen cells. At that point, 4 days, there were 3 queen cells aborted. And when I say aborted, they were being torn down by the bees, so the larva was no longer in there. But what they'd done is they'd built 3 more on that inspection. So they'd aborted 3 and rebuilt with another 3. I hope I'm explaining this okay to you. Now, the following day, that same colony, so after 5 days, had built another 4 queen cells. Why build another 4 when they only really need 1 and they've got 33 already? But this is why it's difficult to humanize bees. The following day, the same colony had 1 queen cell aborted, yet they'd replaced it. Replaced it after, well, I measured it on 6 days. So within between 5 and 6 days, then that's what I'm trying to get at. So, okay. And then this one here, they hadn't got many queen cells. And in my experience, 2 is a very low number anyway. Usually it's somewhere between certainly 6 and probably 20, something of that nature. Anyway, 1 queen cell was aborted after 5 days and they hadn't replaced it. But on the following day, look, they'd replaced it with 4. Well, trying to work out what bees do, if they wanted 5 at that point, why is it 2 days earlier they only had 2? And on the same day, this one had 2 aborted and they had built none on that inspection. So this, as much as anything, I think shows that things are very, very variable. Okay, it is a small sample. I'm absolutely certain that I got the numbers right, but even if I was 1 out, you know, it's not going to be that disastrous. And a scientist is quite capable of miscounting as I am. We've been told for years and years that a queen has packets of sperm from each drone that she mates with, and she uses up in order. Uses one up first, and then goes on and uses those of another. This is apparently, in technical terms, called clumping. It's an old idea that is still common, to the point where I think there are about 5 or 6 questions relevant to this in Linva's talk last week on the mystery of mating. We sort of combined them all together, but there were still obviously people who'd asked the question. I think it's probably come from the fact that a colony might change character, either the colour of the bees, or they're a lot quieter, or they're more angry, or whatever. Perhaps the temper's changed. If anything, I suspect what's happened is there's been a supersedure that the beekeeper didn't notice, but I don't know that. These packets of sperm, that's been disproven a long time ago, and if you look online, there are many studies that dispel that anyway. It's now accepted that sperm is mixed, and in fact, that is what the instrumental inseminators do. The queen uses them from different fathers at random, which is why, of course, we get the different patrolines in a hive. Patroline being a group of workers that are fathered by the different fathers. And in a fairly heavily mongrelized area, that's why you'll get different colours of workers in the same hive. Undersuperin and oversuperin is misinterpretation of that. For years and years and years, beekeepers have known what undersuperin and oversuperin is, but it's come to mean a different thing fairly recently. But what it is when a hive needs another super, if you put it under the existing supers, that's undersuperin. If you put it over the existing supers, that is oversuperin. It is not what people call undersuperin and oversuperin now for wintering. Also, it's not, and I've seen this on several occasions too, where undersuperin is supposed to mean not giving them bees enough room. Oversuperin is where you give them too much. Well, I think somebody's been having a bit of fun there, but there it is. We've all heard of the 100% methods, haven't we? And we get them in beekeeping all the time. And very often it's 100% method of swarm control, or perhaps queen introduction, plus a whole load of other things as well. If anyone tells you that, or you read it, beware. They're probably not a very knowledgeable, or not an observant, or not a very experienced beekeeper. Because if something works first time, of course it's 100%. Perhaps if it works the second time, it's still 100%. But if it fails the third time, all of a sudden it's pretty unreliable. So be very, very careful. And there's absolutely, there's little in beekeeping that is 100%. Perhaps apart from having holes in your pockets that never seem to get mended. Isle of Wight disease happened a long time ago. It was never a disease in the first place. It was really a sort of condition, I suppose. It happened in about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, something like that. And I think in 1919, acarine was discovered, and because some of the samples had acarine in, they assumed that's what the problem was. Well, in my time of beekeeping, 57 years, acarine has never ever been a problem. So I've always been very skeptical about this. But there may have been several symptoms and several causes as well. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we can rely too heavily on the written word, because we know what the written word is like. Perhaps people massage things to suit themselves. What Bailey and Ball did at Rothamsted in the early 1960s is they investigated the Isle of Wight, and although it wasn't still available then, they looked at all the literature and came to the conclusion, which is accepted now by virtually everybody, that it was virus related. But it is still being stated that it's acarine. You can go online and you can see it in loads and loads and loads of places that it was caused by acarine, especially if Brother Adam and Buckfast bees are being sold. Brood pattern. We very often get told that we must have these great big slabs of brood that look lovely just like that. But it's not always the case that we can get things like that. I've seen and heard of many good queens that have been killed, call them what you like, simply because of misinterpretation of the comb that the queens have been laying in. Because in my experience, beekeepers are not very good at reading combs and looking for reasons why things happen. Yes, it can show a good or a failing queen, but you've really got to examine the comb to make sure you know what is happening, not just gawk at it and say, oh yeah, that looks bad, out with a queen, let's get another one. Very often blamed on inbreeding, but I don't think inbreeding in this country is going to be any problem at all. There are several areas where there are very small closed populations, and inbreeding is very definitely not a problem. So it's just something that people chuck in as a bit of a smokescreen, really. Disease, yes, I will accept that disease can be a problem, but if you have a look at the comb, see what's happening, it shouldn't be a problem. And I've got a photograph a little bit later. What about if a colony with a spotty brood pattern is actually quite advanced and is good at detecting and removing brood with Varroa? If we cull the queen, we could well be culling a very, very good trait. I'm not saying we are, I'm just asking the question. Of course, the cells may be full of something, and I've got a photograph, I think, next, when the queen was on that comb laying it up. So if there's something in the cell, of course you can't lay in there. Then, of course, you get a knock-on effect for the rest of the season. So you'll never, ever get if you start off early in the season with what appears to be a poor pattern for whatever reason, you'll get a knock-on effect the rest of the season, and it will never, ever look good. But if you think about it, it's not a natural situation anyway, because in a cavity in a tree, in an expanding brood nest, the queen usually lays underneath the existing brood or at the side. So she has got clear cells, there's nothing in them, because any pollen or nectar is likely to be above that, so she's got a clear run. In a managed colony, she's basically imprisoned between the floor and either the ground board or the queen excluder, depending on what's on the hive. So of course she's then got to reuse cells that she laid in 3 weeks ago. So it is not a natural situation. But I keep asking beekeepers to read the comb. If you think something's wrong, have a look at it, investigate it further. Don't just say, oh, my mentor or whatever says it. If it looks like that, I've got to get rid of the queen. You may well be getting rid of an absolute gem. Here's some virgin comb, never been laid in. Look at the eggs in that. That is really a good egg pattern. Now, if you had that situation and you had that area of comb with eggs in, anything from eggs in up to brood that's either sealed or fairly close to being sealed, yes, you can say that the queen has got a bit of a problem. But there's absolutely no problem at all. And that, of course, is a result. I don't particularly like colonies that just lay wood to wood brood. I always like to see stores up in the top corners like that. They are, I think, the sort of colonies that suit our environment. Going from that one to this one, if that was in your hives, would you requeen that colony? Go on, all of you who will requeen, put your hands up. You can put them down now. Well, only joking, honest. I tell you what, a lot of beekeepers would requeen that because it looks pepper potty, it doesn't look right. But let's just look a bit closer at that area there. There it is. You've got two cells there. The blue one, the worker is about to emerge. The green one isn't even sealed yet, so there's probably 12 days at least difference between those two. That is going to be a knock-on effect throughout the summer. You've got nectarine cells there, which of course you do get in a nectar flow. The bees dump it in the brood area, and you also get quite a lot of pollen within the brood as well. And of course, the queen cannot lay in there. So you've seen that comb. This was actually the next one. This was the next frame in exactly the same colony, because I put in a fresh comb, and of course the queen had a straight run, and she laid a lot up. So you need to be careful what you're seeing. And if you don't believe me that it comes from the same colony, there's my watch strap there. Look at these flowers underneath here, and there's the photograph you just seen. There's my watch strap, and there's a flower underneath. So it came from the same colony. This one here is a frame in the center of a brood nest, right in the center of one of my brood nests in April. Look at that area there. The queen obviously laid it up when she had a chance. That's emerged. She's then, in the meantime, laid outside that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Look at that really good brood. Yes, a few holes, but you're going to get this anyway. So when the colony built up a little bit, or perhaps the weather got a little bit warmer, she laid outside. The same happened again a week or so later, and she's laid outside there. This area here has emerged. So what have the bees done? What they do normally in expanding colony, they filled it up with pollen. So that frame there for the rest of the season will stay very similar to that, and it will have varying ages throughout the summer. Chalk brood, I mentioned disease. There's some chalk brood cells there. Of course, the bees are going to clean them out, and that will be what is termed pepper pot for the rest of the summer, because of course, if you decide to change the queen, you put a new one in there, exactly the same thing's going to happen. So why these people are so sort of paranoid about this this lovely brood pattern, I've absolutely no idea. Perhaps they don't know how to look at a frame. This one here, I was at another beekeeping association, and I was doing a demonstration, and one of the other demonstrators said, "I got to get rid of that queen." So I said, "Well, why?" "Oh, look at that, how bad that brood pattern is." Yes, it isn't very great, but look at all the pollen in there. The poor queen cannot lay in there. So one appeal to beekeeping associations: if you're going to get somebody to do the demonstrating for you, make sure you know a little bit about bees. Oh, matchsticks under crown boards. This is a good one. This is obviously for the winter. Now, they've long been advocated, certainly all the time I've been keeping bees. Some people will put matchsticks under the corn just to lift it up to give a bit of ventilation. Now, if you work it out, the area created is a shade less than double a standard hole. So it's about just over 1.5 standard holes. So if perhaps you do what I do, which is leave one of the holes open, you're creating the same thing. With the propolis, it's likely to build up, plus what's around there as well. You're probably going to get a similar area as a single porta bee escape hole anyway. For some strange reason, this way of doing things is subject to ridicule, which I have to say annoys me a bit, because I don't think it harms the bees at all. And if you want to go and put matchsticks under your crown boards, you go and do it. There's a lot of noisy knolls in beekeeping, and in my view and experience, they ought to be ignored because they don't do any good whatsoever. Cleaning kit. I don't know how many times I've seen it stated that you use caustic soda for dunking your hive tool in and washing your hands and that sort of thing, when the person actually, well, I don't know whether they mean washing soda or not. We should be washing soda. Please, 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 if you have anything to do with a local association or whatever, and bearing in mind, I've seen this in newsletters and online, and I suspect a lot of people listening have as well. Please, please, please sort these people out, because that is incredibly dangerous. Caustic soda will probably take your arm off. We've been told for years and years and years that Varroa feed on haemolymph. I've tried to have a look back to see where the original evidence was, and I can't find any. So I just think it's probably only ever been assumed. Certainly go back to the 1970s, 50 years, and it's certainly in some of the old literature in those days. This, in the last 4, perhaps 5 years, has been discovered in the United States, or largely in the United States, that what Varroa do is primarily they feed on the fat body tissue of the honeybee, not on the haemolymph. The problem with that, of course, is the old information is still in circulation. And of course, all that happened was it got cut and pasted because everyone assumed it was haemolymph. Of course, if it's in books, you can't do anything about it. But if you're involved with an association and you've got perhaps a website or leaflets or booklets or something, next time you update them, please, please, please change the information. How many times have I heard we need to import queens to increase the genetic diversity in this country? You hear it on a very regular basis, especially if somebody perhaps mentions that imports perhaps ought to be banned. That is another issue altogether. But we've got approximately 250,000 of managed colonies in England and Wales. Plus, of course, all the wild or feral colonies, they're not wild, feral colonies. So we're going to have certainly 300,000 plus. If that's going to cause us problems, I don't think so. So very unlikely, I think. So I think that's that one straight out the window. Keep hearing that wild colonies are a reservoir for disease. And yes, there are people who actually want to kill them, and there are others who won't accept swarms in case they come from wild colonies. Well, I have removed several hundred colonies from wild places, and I can tell you that overall they are far, far, far healthier than managed bees are, because if they weren't, nature would take them out. But with a lot of managed colonies, people mollycoddle them, mask any problems that they've got, and they struggle through. Whereas if they're in the wild, they would be a statistic. I have never, ever seen foul brood in a wild colony, not once, but I've seen it in managed colonies on many occasions. if I've seen chalk brood or sac brood in a wild colony, it's usually very, very light, certainly much lighter than what I see in managed colonies. And again, I suppose it's if they've got if they're susceptible to either of those diseases, there's probably a weakness in them some other way. The winter would just take them out. American foul brood was brought to the UK by American servicemen during World War II. This has only just come into, well, say it's been around for perhaps 10 or 15 years. And the assumption is that it was these American servicemen that had honey sent to them and they discarded the containers. Well, I found a report of a conference that was held in Rothamsted on May the 19th, 1934, called Brood Diseases of Bees. And in the booklet, Dennis Morland, who was the head of Rothamsted, I think he retired in 1938, but I can't remember properly. He reported that in Somerset, American foul brood has been endemic along the south side of Quantock since 1919, 20 years earlier. He also reported that it was in other counties too. And at the same meeting, Annie Betts stated in her paper called History of Our Knowledge of Brood Diseases, Doolittle and Jones in the USA in the early 80s, obviously the 1880s, and her own countryman Samuel Simmons in 1887 also realised there were two varieties of foul brood. Well, until they were separated in about 1905, they were assumed to be the same thing. But of course, it was then discovered that it wasn't. The British black bee is extinct. We've all heard that. British black bee being subspecies Apis mellifera. This was stated 100 years or more ago by Brother Adam and others. And of course, if you think about it, they had a reason to do so. Because they were either breeding different kinds of bees or they were selling imports. So what better way of publicising your own material than to say that the main opposition at the time was extinct. In their defence, though, they didn't have morphometry or DNA facilities like we've got now, so perhaps they didn't quite know what they were dealing with. What is fairly certain, though, with their importations, they probably wrecked the local population of black bees anyway. However, there are still some pure AMMs around, but sadly they are in pockets. They're on islands or in isolated areas, or where the imports won't survive very long. Jumbo hives. I wonder how many of you have got jumbo hives thinking that they're 14 by 12s. Jumbo hives are not 14 by 12s, despite what some suppliers advertise them as. And the reason I know that is because on May the 1st, 1899 issue of Gleanings in Bee Culture, which is now known as Bee Culture, it was published by the AI Root Company, who are American suppliers of bee kit. There was a letter from a man called A.N. Draper, who was a commercial beekeeper in Illinois. And he wrote the letter to E.R. Root, who was the editor of Bee Culture at the time. And he suggested that they increase the depth of Langstroth frames to that of Dadant. And he challenged Roots that if they built 30 or 40 of these hives and used them in their own apiary, if after 3 years they weren't better than what was already there, Mr. Draper will pay all the expenses of the manufacture and development. The challenge got accepted and they became known as Draper's Barns. Now, there's not quite, they don't use Daden frames, they use Langstroth frames, which are Hoffman's, but on a different spacing. Now, the challenge was accepted and they were offered for sale by Roots, and they were certainly have been sold ever since, and in fact even our major suppliers still sell them. So the reason I mention this, folks, is because if you get any perhaps beginners and they buy a jumbo hive that's sold to them as a 14 by 12, if they then go to the manufacturers and ask for some jumbo frames, they are not going to fit. So please, please, please don't get confused. But it's also another example of how terminology gets changed over the years, usually because somebody doesn't know something. Or in this case, of course, suppliers could be using it for publicity purposes. Now, Zima sample size, what's that? You all know it, it's 30. And you all know why a sample of 30. Because, or the usual reason given, the 30B sample is based on statistical probability of a 90% chance of seeing a 10% infection rate or a 95% chance of seeing a 15% infection rate. Now that in various forms is spread around both the northern and the southern hemisphere, and it's what a lot of people believe. Sadly, it's not the reason why the sample of bees is 30. A beekeeper who's was at Rothamsted for a long time, where Dr. Bailey actually worked on bee diseases, wrote to me in personal correspondence this: the 30B sample was standardised at Rothamsted many years ago because the centrifuge tubes that they were using for various purposes and had lying about the lab just happened to contain 30 bees. Much later, Dr. Bailey consulted statisticians, and they concluded that to improve the chances of detecting infections, the sample size would have to be increased 10 or 100-fold, and this wasn't practical. A matchbox also happens to helpfully contain 30 bees. So there you are, folks, that come up with all that magical mathematical equation. Forget it. Oh, eating bananas before handling bees. You mustn't do this. You know why? It makes them really angry. And there's all sorts of stuff on the internet about bees being absolutely vicious and all that sort of thing. If you don't believe me, go and read it. Have you ever tried it? Go on, put your hands up again, those who have. No, 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 it was a joke. Go on, give it a go, really, because I have. And guess what? Absolutely no problem. Not only that, you probably already worked out they've done an experiment as well. Not once, but several times, and here's one of them. I took a banana, peeled it, took a strong colony, and you can argue that isn't strong if you like, but I'm telling you that it's strong. Laid it on the top, and I took a photograph after 15 minutes. I also took another one after 30 minutes of another one, and it's exactly the same. Are those bees angry? No, they're not. When eggs are laid, they're upright in the base of the cell, then gradually lay over. Well, I have to admit to believing that until about 10 years ago. And you can guess what happened. I took a queen away from a colony And almost 3 days later, I had a look at it, and lo and behold, there were eggs looking at me, still upright. And I thought, hang on, there's something going wrong here. So I did the same again and again and again, and then I took some photographs. They're sadly not good enough to put up here, but and what I found that it wasn't correct. You folk try it. Go on, just remove a queen and check every 24 hours. If you are good at taking photographs, then make sure you mark out a piece of comb and take them. And I think you'll find that they don't move over as we're told they do. You all know what a swarm contains, don't you? A queen and a large percentage of the foraging bees in a colony. Of course you know it, because that's what we've always been told. Just have a look closely at the swarm and you will see there are drones and there are bees of all ages. There are older bees, and there's certainly bees that have flown, because you'll probably see bees with pollen in a swarm. What you'll also see is the little grey downy bees. Have a look at the colony it swarmed from the following day, and you probably wouldn't even spot any difference than the day before. So not all the foraging bees have, or a large percentage have gone. Getting back to Rothamsted, D. Morland, who was actually Dennis Morland, and Colin Butler did some work on this. Now, Morland was in charge of Rothamsted, and then he retired and Colin Butler took over. So Butler in 1940 wrote that up to 70% of bees less than 10 days old in a swarm. So they're not such a high percentage of foraging bees as we're told. Okay, that's up to 70%. You know, we can dispel that one. Queenless bees are always aggressive. That's what we keep hearing. And if a beekeeper goes to a meeting or online or something like that and says, "Oh, my bees are really angry," but the first question is, are they queenless? The assumption is it's always correct. Well, I've handled an awful lot of colonies in my time, and that, I'm afraid, is not my experience. Because of all the queen rearing I do, I come across many, many, many queenless colonies. I've probably handled 6 today. Is there a problem? Really, with me, it's just something that is one of these myths that just keeps going and going and going. If they're bad-tempered anyway, I would agree that yes, they can be narky, whether they've got a queen or not. Try it, folks. Don't just think to yourself, "Oh, they're queenless, they're going to be bad-tempered." Just try it. Now, the age-old Albert Einstein quote, and you've all heard it: "If the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left." Well, that has, you could probably get 20 different versions of that. The earliest known version was in a French publication in 1965. Einstein died 10 years earlier than that. So I think that, as much as anything, is one of the reasons why it's generally accepted that he didn't say or write it. But it is still out there, and sadly, by a lot of beekeeping associations. I see it on websites, go to a show, and there's a little notice up. There's all sorts of stuff like that. Please, 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 if we're going to tell the general public things, then tell them something that's actually correct. Interesting facts about queen bee. This is the queen bee. This is something that I've discovered in the last week or so, and there's some great discoveries that I didn't know about here. I found it online and in more than one place, so it had been cut and pasted. And here it is. Once she is ruler of the hive, the queen bee needs to mate. She flies out of the hive to mate with 10, 15 drones for 3 days. 3 days? Last week, Linva, in a lovely presentation, told me that they were all quickies. So what do? Do we believe Linva's a beekeeper and knows what she's talking about, or the written word that's online? A lot of people, sadly, would believe what's online. She stores the sperms from each drone in her spermatheca. Not too much wrong with that. She can use this sperm to fertilize eggs for the next 7 years. Well, at the rate queens are going now, she's going to manage to do that for about 6 years after she's died, because the longest I've had a known queen live is 6 years. Most of them are usually 4 or perhaps 5. That was before we had the problems with the queens. Now you're jolly lucky to get them last 12 months, or even to get them in the second year. Now, this is the best bit. Each day the queen can lay up to 20,000 eggs and exceed her own body weight in eggs. 20,000 eggs, if you look on online, is in several places. Now, the queen has really got to get moving, because even if she works a flat out for 24 hours and she doesn't do her hair or change her underwear, she's laying an egg every 4.32 seconds. That is pretty amazing. Not only that, in order to accommodate all this lot, we're going to need a hive with 10 British standard brood boxes. Why on earth didn't the person that wrote this check their figures and work it out? The worker bees cannot create any new queen bee larvae because of the queen's output of the queen mandibular pheromone. Yes, pheromone, you got it, there it is, in more than one place, copied and pasted. Sorry folks, I've been keeping bees for 57 years. I've obviously been doing everything absolutely wrong. I am now going to retire. I'm going to give up beekeeping altogether. I'm going to leave you folk on your own, and I'm going to let the dogs answer any questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, it's a bit dark here. Well, Roger, thank you very much. Get a bit more light on me. I love some of those quotes. We've had quite a few questions, but conscious that time's ticking on, so I'll just pick on 2 or 3 if that's okay. You mentioned about propolis inside hives.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was, and I think it's quite a good one, would it help to have a rough interior on the inside of a hive rather than the smooth interior walls that are normally sort of supplied with beehives?
Actually, no, I don't think it will. The thinking is with the roughing is that if you've got a rough surface, it's likely to be perhaps loose in some way. So the bees are really holding it together. I think there's been attempts to get the manufacturers to make them out of sawn timber. But I think the problem is, I'll have to check, but I'm a metalworker, not a woodworker. But my guess is that the machinery is so accurate these days that it wouldn't be able to handle sawn material. It's got to be prepared. That's my guess. No, I don't think it will help, because those boards on that building, they were prepared. It was just ordinary tongue and groove. They were prepared, and the bees had propolized that up. Also, if you get a standard brood box, they'll propolize the inside up as well.
Okay. Just need to point out another one of your mistakes, if you don't mind. You talked about the queen cells and how you counted them carefully over 6 days. And you said that you shook all the bees off to find the queen cells because you had to do that really carefully. Haven't you been told not to shake a frame with queen cells on?
Yes, I have, and I keep meaning to do work on this. We keep being told that we damage the queen cells. Well, the old chap that taught me beekeeping, he shook ever so many combs with queen cells on, and they I don't think he had a problem. I think it's borne out by the small number that that haven't been damaged. When I say shake off, I'm not giving them a great big thump, and I'm not getting rid of all the bees, because I do flick some off with a twig. I understand where the questioner is coming from, that perhaps I could be damaging some, but I don't think so. I don't want people to stop shaking frames, but I have to say that I do shake them with queen cells on.
Okay. I hope you don't mind, but time's ticking on, and conscious people have got dogs to walk and everything. Well, so just one more question, if you don't mind. How often, and this isn't related to something you said, but I thought it was a good question. How often do you come across 2 laying queens in a hive?
Oh, very regularly. I think I've got 2 now. I've even had 3. And interestingly, Linva last week said she'd had 3. And I think it's mother, daughter, and a granddaughter.
Okay. Okay. There are a few more questions. For everybody that's written the questions in, I've noted them all down. We've got a questions and answers webinar coming later on as one of the next session of webinar discussions, and that will be to a panel of people. So rather than just put Roger on the spot, we can actually press that into a lot of people. Thank you very much for attending tonight, and thank you in particular to Roger for sharing a certain number of years. I won't mention the years because I said it was how long I was born ago, but yeah, 57 years of experience. I learn lots from Roger all the time, and actually just listening to stuff like this helps me open my eyes and my ears to new opportunities for learning. So I hope today that Roger has actually just sort of whetted your appetite to be more curious and inquisitive about bees. Thank you once again, Roger, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Notice I haven't said anything's wrong. That's dangerous. Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah. Good night.